I thank the members, Ms. He Ting-Ru and Mr. Leon Pereira, for moving the motion. Since the government launched the Conversations on Singapore Women's Development in September 2020, we have held 160 conversations involving more than 5,700 participants from all walks of life. Participants include men and women, young and old, homemakers, professionals, executives, social workers, students, and many more. And they have provided many suggestions and feedback. Women organizations such as Singapore Council for Women's Organizations, SCWO, NTUC Women and Family Unit, and the PA Women's Integration Network hosted many of these conversations. Other women organizations, including PAP Women's Wing, AWARE, Trade Association Women's Subgroups, and student union groups have submitted their recommendations before the stipulated deadline of 31st July 2021. The government had said at the onset of the conversations that it would consolidate views from the conversations and present action plans for the future in the form of a white paper. The white paper would form the basis of a full debate in Parliament, as it would have taken the range of views expressed by all participants throughout the process into account. I thank the members for their views and inputs shared today, and I would like to assure them that their views today will feed into this process. For today, I will focus on the historical context for women's development in Singapore and also provide an update on the Singapore Women's Conversations. Madam Deputy Speaker, a discussion on women's development in Singapore needs to take into account global developments, our history, the socio-economic conditions we are in, and the values and aspirations of our society. We cannot look at issues in silos at a point in time without understanding where they sit relative to the bigger picture. The past 130 years has been a time of great awakening and great progress for women in many parts of the world. Women's suffrage gained momentum in the early 1900s in the Western world. From the 1930s, there were more jobs for women in the developed world as the services industry grew. Singapore found itself in these worldwide winds of change as we moved towards independence in the 1950s. But what was the status of our women then, and what path did we set ourselves on? In the census of 1957, the general literacy rate of women in Singapore was 29%, and only 21.6% of the total female population aged 15 years and above were economically active. The early PAP party leaders had a vision for the women of Singapore, and they believed in women's advancement and gender equality. I have with me an original copy of the People's Actions Party's manifesto for the Legislative Assembly elections in 1959. And under its proposed program, Item 10 states to raise the status of women by introducing a monogamous marriage law. This was further elaborated in the PAP's 5-year plan for 1959 to 1964, titled The Task Ahead, where there is a specific mention on the emancipation of women. And I read, "Women, who form nearly half of our population, have an important part to play in our national construction. In the first instance, in order to emancipate them from the bonds of feudalism and conservatism, a monogamous marriage law will be passed." Further down in the paragraph, "We shall foster the principle, if necessary, by legislation, that there shall be equality of women with men in all spheres, and we shall encourage them to come forward and play a leading role in politics, administration, business and industry, education, and in other spheres." Faithful to its publicly declared goals, the PAP took action when it formed the government in 1959. The Minister of Labour and Law, Mr. K.M. Bryan, presented the Women's Charter Bill to the first session of the First Legislative Assembly of the State of Singapore on 2nd March 1960. At the second reading of the bill, he said, the government is carrying out its promise that it will enact legislation which will make it an offence to contract other than monogamous marriages and to consolidate the existing laws relating to marriage, divorce, the rights and duties of married person, the maintenance of wives and children, and the punishment of offences against women and girls. This paved the way for the passage of the Women's Charter in 1961, which was significant as it raised the social standing of women by institutionalizing the equal standing of men and women in marriage and ensuring the welfare and protection of women in Singapore. It is most apt, then, that 60 years later, in September 2020, to advance the trajectory of women's progress and to provide them with enhanced protection, that our current Minister of Law, Mr. K. Shanmugam, would initiate the conversations on Singapore women's development. This is the PAP government's continued commitment to the advancement of our Singapore women, in partnership with the whole of society, to continue to support, enable, and empower our women. Between the passing of the Women's Charter in 1961 till today, Singapore underwent rapid transformation and the status of women improved. The political leaders rightly reasoned that for Singapore to be lifted from its fairly low economic status in the 1950s, it needed its entire population to be as highly educated and economically productive as possible. The Singapore government systematically introduced and improved legislation, policies, and initiatives to advance the progress of Singapore women and worked in close partnership with the community over the years. 41 ruling party women MPs, 7 opposition women MPs and NCMPs, and 34 female NMPs have sat in this House to vote on legislation which empowers our women. First on the agenda was the need to make quality education freely accessible to both boys and girls. Universal education for children of all races, gender, and backgrounds was implemented. Boys and girls were equally valued and given as much opportunity as possible to pursue education and skills-based training. Female literacy rate went from 29% in 1957 to 54.3% in 1970 and crossed 80% in 1988. The female share of university intake has remained at about 50% since around 1980. Healthcare services for women and girls were improved. Did you know that in 1966, KK Women's and Children's Hospital entered the world records for delivering the highest number of newborns within a single medical facility for that year and continued to hold on to the record for the next 10 years? And we continue to care for the physical and mental well-being of our women and girls. My colleague, Ms. Rahayu Mazam, will touch on this later. Female employment was encouraged. Female labour force participation rate for those aged 15 and above went up from around 21.6% in 1957 to 29.5% in 1970. In 1991, the female labour force participation rate for those aged 25 to 64 was 51.5% and stands at 76.6% now. Current programs such as career trial and job growth incentive also encourage women who have left the workforce to re-enter the workforce, and tripartite partners work with employers to promote pro-family work environments. The community has also been active to promote women's advancement. In the 1970s to 80s, several women's organizations such as SCWO, NTUC Women's Committee, PAP Women's Wing, AWARE, and AWA were formed. In 1978, the first Family Service Centre opened to support vulnerable women and families in need. In 1996, the National Family Violence Networking System, which involved various community partners, was set up to address the problem of family violence. The government also knew that women needed to be supported as they strived to balance caregiving and work-life harmony. In 2001, the first marriage and parenthood package was launched, followed by subsequent packages in 2004, 2008, and beyond. Leave provisions for mothers and fathers were increased over the years, and additional support was provided for families via subsidies for maternity-related medical costs and other expenses. Separately, subsidies for childcare and infant care were also provided to families. as Singapore went from mudflats to metropolis. The Singapore women similarly made significant strides over the years, and their contributions are integral to our Singapore story. Exactly 60 years later from the passing of the Women's Charter Bill, the Government of Singapore launched the Conversations on Singapore Women's Development to chart the next lap forward for our women's progress. Our efforts are consistent and unwavering. There was an open call to the public to participate in the conversations, and we heard from more than 5,700 participants. Let me now update members on the key themes that have emerged from the conversations. And I hope that the members who have spoken before me will be pleased to note that many of their inputs have been reflected in the key themes. We heard Singaporeans' aspirations and hopes for Singapore women. A, that women and men are equally empowered to achieve their career aspirations, and women would not be denied opportunities on the basis of gender and/or family commitments. B, that caregivers' contributions to society are better recognized and there is more sharing of caregiving responsibilities between men and women. C, that stronger protection will be provided to women. D, that support be strengthened for vulnerable groups of women. E, undergirding these aspirations, participants hoped that we could overcome traditional mindsets and stereotypes about gender roles in our society. My colleagues and I were greatly inspired by participants' vision of a Singapore where women and men work as close partners so that real choices are enabled for women, and where whole of society works together so that everyone can achieve their fullest potential. We thank everyone for participating actively and for sharing your personal stories, your challenges, your aspirations, and ideas. While the 31st July deadline for submission of feedback has passed, we understand that many Singaporeans and local organizations are still brimming with ideas for Singapore women's progress. Any new ideas from today's session will also feed into the overall process. We continue to welcome your feedback, so please send them to us before end August. Even as we are reviewing the feedback and preparing for the white paper for debate in Parliament, we have begun work to address some of the feedback that we have received, building on what we have already been doing to support Singapore women. A, to enhance protection for women, MHA has reviewed the sentencing framework for sexual and hurt offences and increased the penalties for 3 specific sexual offences. The Interagency Task Force on Family Violence will release its recommendations later this year. MCI launched a Singapore Together Alliance for Action to tackle online harms, especially those targeted at women and girls. B, to cultivate a shift in mindsets. MOE has enhanced its character and citizenship education curriculum to build an appreciation of the equity of roles in the family, respect for both genders, and the importance of not ascribing to gender stereotypes when considering education and career pathways. C, to review how we can stamp out discrimination in the workplace, MOM announced that it was setting up a tripartite committee to study whether legislation should be pursued and its appropriate scope. Madam Deputy Speaker, as the saying goes, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. In the past 60 years, we have made significant progress because of partnership at all levels of society. This year, through the conversations launched by the government, we will have outlined and united around a common vision for Singapore women's progress. Given the importance of Singapore women's progress to our nation, the Prime Minister will be attending the final session of the conversations in September, and he will be sharing our plans for the future, taking into consideration the feedback received from the conversations. Madam Deputy Speaker, I support the good intentions of the motion. Individuals, families, employers, and the community have all played important roles in this partnership. In the next lap of our journey, let us all work even more closely together towards a fairer and more inclusive society where our Singapore women can realize their fullest potential. Thank you.